Hi, thanks for being here. As mentioned, I'm going to introduce the other two. Let's start with you, and I hope I'm not butchering your name, Shradha Sharma. Is that okay? Is that good? She founded Your Story in 2008. Your Story is a media company that is covering entrepreneurship in India and also in other countries, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Published in English and in 12 Indian languages. They have raised around $13 million in funding. I hope that's correct. And before that, she was a journalist working at CNBC and Times of India, and she was also among the Fortune 40 under 40. And here we have Niklas Wirminghaus, who graduated from Henry-Nannen-Schule. It's one of the most prestigious journalism schools in Germany. He then worked as a deputy managing editor at Gründerszene, a website covering startups, and is now an editor at Kapital, which is a business magazine here in Germany. He has covered like everything from net neutrality to fintech to media, and is an expert on startups, as we will hear, hopefully. Shradha, let's start with you. Can you tell me a bit about how starting your own company has changed your view on entrepreneurs and also how you're covering startups?
Thank you so much. Just one to clarify, you were right on my introduction, but I haven't raised 13 million. Right now I've raised 8.5 million, but I hope it becomes 13. Just to clarify on the number. You know, for me, I was a journalist in Times of India and CNBC news channel in India. And when you write about people, and entrepreneurs and especially startups, then there, as a journalist, you know, you are an observer and you make observations. You say, oh, how much money went into the company? What are they doing? And you always have a very, you have a critique's lens because you are judging and very quick. Oh, this company was not able to scale. This company was not able to do this. This founder didn't do this right and all that. But I think it changed for me when you become an entrepreneur yourself. Because then you are not an observer, but you are a participant. You are right there in the hot seat. And then you understand that running a business of any kind, be it a 10-member team, 2-member team, or 100 or 1,000, is very difficult. And I would say for me, being an entrepreneur, writing about startups and people trying to make something out of their lives has been one of the very powerful journeys, but it has made me very empathetic. So I'm not very quick to pass judgments, and whenever I read some judgment or someone just trying to say, oh, this is not going to work, with that sense of, hey, I'm an expert, and that's why I am very scared of the word expert, because who is an expert is very difficult to answer, especially in the startup space. So as a founder today, having written stories of 72,000 entrepreneurs, I would say what comes to me very easily, hopefully, is empathy. And understanding that it is very hard, very lonely, very dark. Besides the glamour and the light, it's not an easy life. So that's what I have learned founding Your Story.
Niklas, are you empathetic covering startups?
I mean, it's a good question. And it's rightfully that you question the word expert. Can a journalist be an expert who has never worked for an internet startup, which is, in my case, part of true, because Gründerszene, the online magazine, was a startup in the beginning, exited to Axel Springer, to a big publishing house. But I know the feeling that the money maybe won't last till the end of the year, that you have to lay off people. It's a tough life. On the other hand, I think it's a fine line. You have to be sympathetic towards founders, and I usually say the most important thing is if they fail, don't judge them for like trying. Yeah. Judge them if they made mistakes, especially if they were maybe not very honest. But other than that, you have to be critical as a journalist. I think that's the core function of journalism and of business journalism as well.
Being critical is a very good point. And I think in startup coverage, there's a lot of like, this startup is super hyped and super successful right now, and this one has failed. Like it feels often that there's not that much in between. How do you decide even who to cover and in what situation?
It's not easy. I mean, telling that a startup is hyped usually comes from they already have received media attention. Probably they have raised money. That's a good indicator. But in very few cases, we can actually say their product is working. They have X, Y, Z customers. They already made money. Usually that's kept secret. I mean, that's the case in Germany. I know that the culture in the US is kind of different. They're more open, they're more transparent in relation to the company's numbers, but it makes the job not easy. And it should lead us journalists to question, are we going to cover this startup? Are we going to write a headline that is telling people this startup is hyped and is going to be the next big thing? And I know that especially in online journalism, where you have a rhythm that is rather quick, it can be difficult, and it's not always the case.
How do you see that topic?
I think be it Silicon Valley or I don't know much as of now about Germany, but different markets that I've observed, and particularly in India, one of the big indicators of the hype that happens is funding. Because the funding is so far and few that suddenly an entrepreneur or a company raises money and they get attention. And it's celebrated. It suddenly becomes like a very big thing. To me, I think that is not an indication of success, and we have seen it. So many companies who've raised in the heydays of 2014 and 15 shut down. They closed shop, even after raising huge amount of money. And I think that has brought a little bit more, hopefully, sensibility in media to say that every funding should not be celebrated. And I think it stems somewhere also from Silicon Valley, because the whole conversation right now, I don't know which one is, but the big thing right now is e-cycles and taxis, and they're just getting funded. The other one is marijuana startups, which are getting a lot of attention because they are getting funded. So then suddenly the news travels across the globe, and then you'd say, oh, in India, this startup got funded. They raised in this space, similar space, and then there's a huge attention. I think that, like any other market, is all about maturity. And I think in India now it's 10 years where this startup news, and I've started in 2008, we've been covering. I think that hype is slightly settling because we've seen so much. In fact, in India, $24 billion have been invested in startups in the last few years. But now the day of reckoning is, as I might say, because 10 years of venture capital investing, and now we're looking at exits. So people are realizing that the hype around funding is not actually the indication of success.
I mean, you're right. One more thing about the amount of VC seen as an indicator. We are trusting investors because they get access to the books. They can look what are the calculations, how successful is your first product or your minimal viable product, what are unit economics, and based on that, or how good is your team, based on that, they're putting capital into the company. So that's our only way to judge how good an emerging startup is. We're trusting investors. In some cases, they make mistakes, but a lot of them, they're really good at judging what startups is promising, what are not.
I agree with you, but I slightly differ. I don't trust investors because world over, the startup market would have been very different, be it in Silicon Valley or it's more or in India or wherever. I would say that last 10 years, if it has covering this space and observing global markets, has taught me to not blindly trust or not trust investors because some extraordinary companies have been missed out. They have not been able to raise funding because the hype, which starts at the epicenter of startup-dom, which is Silicon Valley, translates into different geographies, and copycats, which we see all over, rise. And we have not seen local innovations get that center stage because the money originates from certain parts, and some of those VCs, they have that copy-paste model. It worked in US, it will work in Germany, it will work in India, but that necessarily doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's the story of the Uber for X, the Uber for country X or thing X that we see a lot, I think. And we just talked a bit about exits, and one big exit in India that is on the horizon is Flipkart. For those of you who don't know, Flipkart is like an online store similar to Amazon. And right now, both Walmart and Amazon are basically bidding to buy part of the startup or all of it, which will be, like, if it happens, when it happens, it will be a huge story worldwide. And I'd like to hear what you think about this whole thing. Will one of them buy Flipkart? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there is no other option, but there will be some buying happening. It's just about valuation and pricing, because Flipkart has raised a lot of venture capital money, and I'm sure all the investors would like. Tiger has been one of the early investors, so they would look at exit and at a good pricing. So it's in a good position. From one lens, if you see, it's a good position because both Walmart and Amazon are vying to buy Flipkart. But if you ask me as an Indian, as an observer of Indian startup ecosystem, one, I'll be very happy because there'll be huge exit. That means more money coming into the startup. You know, with Indian economy, GDP at 7.3%, we're saying we're the fastest growing economy in the world. That means that there'll be more external capital coming. But if you ask me as an entrepreneur, I would say I had wished that Flipkart had existed and survived on its own rather than getting acquired, because that is a journey which in India, like, you know, Indian retail is like in billions, and I think it's a huge, huge market. So the question for me would be that could Flipkart have sustained without the acquisition also? So there's two parts to it, but from a startup landscape, I think India will become extremely attractive once this acquisition happens, because there's a lot of money waiting to again get into the Indian market. After this, it will happen. Yeah.
I'd like to talk a bit about like what is similar in both markets and what is like different. We talked a bit about copycats. This is something we also saw in Germany. I'm not sure who of you is familiar with Rocket Internet, but they are a big investing company that have been known for basically doing those copycat models, like finding US startups mostly that are super successful and rebuilding them for the German market. There was also a lack in funding in the past few years. I think that's gotten better. But I'd just like to know like, how you see the market evolving in the past couple of years until now. Niklas, if you want to take that first.
That's a big question. I mean, let's start with the copycat perception. I know that the German startup scene has been described by this term a lot in the last couple of years. It has gotten better. I never really bought into that notion for two reasons. One is, I mean, even US founders copy. Look at Mark Zuckerberg. Basically what Facebook does in innovation is copying ideas of...
Snapchat.
For instance, Snapchat. And nobody's really getting angry about that or like leaving Facebook. Second, I think even in copying an idea and transferring it to another market and executing this idea in a successful fashion, this is not easy, and it's also innovation. If you can create a process or a business process or market a product differently for a different audience, and you get that right, and that's why I mean, Rocket has its problems, but there are probably other problems than relying on the copycat models for too long. Right, capital. So I think it has gotten better. There's more VC money around in Germany, but we're far from the level of VC money that's around in the US. So I think we're like at 2.6 billion euros per year, which is probably less than a funding round for Uber. We have an ecosystem by now that hasn't been around 10 years ago, which is good. So there are local investors, there are founders that sold their company, got money, and are now reinvesting in young founders. There's heaps of experts telling startups what to do. And in terms of business models, I think there is a reorientation away from B2C, so like products that are put up for the mass markets, which is not that easy in Europe, because in Germany you have your target audience is like 100 million. In US, the moment you launch your product, you have a market of 300. In India, the moment you launch your product, it's even more. So a lot of founders are looking at B2B, so they're marketing to enterprises, build software, use the capacities of engineers that we have in Germany a lot. So that's a trend that I see a lot.
Your story has also started in Germany last year. And probably your perception of the German market has changed through that too, I could imagine. Can you tell us a bit about that? What did you think about the German startup scene before you really went into it as well, and now?
So for me, it's just learning. I wouldn't say that I know much at all about the market, except that we've been talking a lot to people. And just day before yesterday, I met an investor, Noel Joe. He's just started, his fund is in Munich, and they just launched in Berlin. And I was speaking to him and understanding that what has been the exit in the market. And I think he said a very relevant point, that his fund is doing well, and investors here in German market are getting returns. And that's why the scene will grow more, because the returns are happening. And one very important thing is that when it comes to returns and exits, we are always thinking about $1 billion or €1 billion exit. But the interesting point is that if companies have raised 8 to 10 million, in the range of max $8 to $10 million, and if they're getting $60 to $70 million exits or $100 million, that's a huge exit, an amount. And those kind of things have started to happen in Germany. So according to him, and he's an investor investing quite a lot here. So he was saying that he thinks that the market is really going to grow and more money is going to come here. And yeah, we are meeting a lot of interesting entrepreneurs. We have met some entrepreneurs who are also looking at expanding to India, selling some of the things the products that they've built. So yeah, it's an interesting time. Of course, for us, the question is between German language and English. And one discovery right now, I'm in that discovery phase, is that are people going to read English or do we have to really write in German language? But I heard from Lead Accelerator, Adidas's accelerator, they said that English will work. So maybe all of you will have to give me a feedback on that, what is going to work here. Yeah, so it's good.
Do Indian founders look at all at Europe or Germany? Is this an interesting market, or you only look at China and the US?
So that's a very good question. I think, and I believe that for us, we've been looking at, like most markets, to US. And in fact, this one study says that in US, 70% of the companies have one Indian as a co-founder or in the senior management team of all these companies. So when I go to Google, Facebook, LinkedIn in Silicon Valley, I feel I'm in India because I see so many Indians. We are 1.4 billion people now. So yes, we look at US a lot, not as much at China, because China is we are a democracy. China is closed. But China has a lot of things to teach, because India today has 750 million mobile users, and most of the mobile people have not seen laptop, and China also had the similar journey. So a lot to learn from China, but India looks at US more. But I hope with your story, Germany, we are able to change that and say that, hey, let's look at collaboration with Europe. Let's figure out, rather than just looking at US. Yeah.
Do you in general think that working together over several countries, like India, Germany, just as an example, but also with the US, with the UK, within Europe, do you think that's going to be more relevant in the upcoming months and years?
I mean, usually founders, they're transactionally oriented, so they want to see this, if this is interesting as a market. So if I look back at into the years in the Berlin startup scene, India, for instance, was only interesting as a target market. So Rocket tried to enter the market, kind of failed. Creditech entered it, I think, last year. I mean, there's a lot of cooperation, for instance, between Germany and Silicon Valley. So you have like innovation labs in the Valley, or there are German founders abroad, Americans coming to Berlin. It's good because it brings the ecosystems closer. So investors from the US are actually now giving money to German startups, sometimes the other way around. It's more promising and necessary, I think, in Europe, because these countries are limited in size and market size, and it's essential to harmonize the ecosystems, so investors invest across borders, so that legal issues don't arise when you like cross a border, stuff like that.
To wrap this up, we want to open for a quick Q&A. We have like 3-4 minutes left. Does anybody have a question? Do we have a mic, or? Thank you.
Hello. So my origin is definitely Indian. I look like one anyways. And we are located in LA. So we cover both Indian markets, US markets, and we have a startup in Germany. Now, your question, according to the biggest constraint that we find, and we figure out the reason that why India looks more at the US, is it potential of the buying power for the customers, or people are more easy, like to listen to a call or to get into a product? That's one thing. And probably the taxations are more liberal in the US compared to Europe. Like you have to go through multiple compliance, like to setting up a company takes 1 day, 24 hours, you're up and running. In Germany, it will take you probably a month, and then you go through a bunch of hassle, and then people are like, will I focus on this or focus on there? Like, is it like, you think there has to be a change in that? What's your perspective?
I mean, this is a complaint that comes up like all the time and for years. Let me say this. If you're building up a truly successful company, it's a really tough and demanding job. I mean, setting up a company is a really easy task, even if it takes like 20 or 30 days. Come on, you can make it. I mean, so people are always complaining about that it takes too many days to found a company. I don't think it's that difficult. Of course, it could be easier. Of course, it could be faster. Probably going to change, but I don't think it's the main problem founders face.
Anybody else? Over here.
Handsome guy.
Hey, according to this, at the moment we are talking about data protection and taxation and everything in Europe, and there's a new narrative that Europe sets this up as a USP for a global standard and going forward. Do you share this idea of USP, or do you think it's, like he says, restriction for innovation?
A very good question. One is that I'll just tell you, as an entrepreneur, we are working on, because we have readership here, we have to do a lot of things in India, which my tech team told me that to get compliant in terms of how we are storing data and information. So there's one entrepreneur part of me which is complying. Otherwise, I think the taxation, you have to pay 8 million euros or 4% of your income. So that's huge, and that's quite strict. But to answer your question, India, as of now, for the first time in the history of the country, which has now, I think, 1.4 billion people, we have a social security kind of a digital infrastructure called Aadhaar, where all of our data, for the first time, is there digitally, which is like 1.4 billion people's data. To me, as the citizen of this country with so many people, data is very important, and having control over my data and my data is not misused is very important. So this whole narrative which has come, which is about having access to your own data and a little control where my data is not used to make a fool of me is very important. So I look up to actually Europe, because that standard that they are setting is important. And somewhere a little discipline is required across the world, and especially in countries like India, where we have so many people with so much of information online. Who is going to access that? How is that going to work for us? Who controls that, right? So those things, actually by setting this dialogue, it is important that it percolates across the world. And it's not like 2-3 companies in the world who are controlling and shaping my opinion. Yeah, so I agree, and I don't see that as a deterrent at all.
Okay, thank you to the panelists.
I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming.
Can we have a round of applause, please?
Thank you for great moderation. Thank you.